This week's episode of the And She Looked Up podcast is brought to you by Fine Lime Designs. If the name sounds familiar, that's because it's my design business and the work I do there helps make this podcast possible. If you love colorful and whimsical art prints, greeting cards, and journaling stickers, then head over to my Etsy shop for a delightful browse. Just search for Fine Lime, like the fruit, designs, all one word, on Etsy, or click the link in the show notes. And now, on with this week's episode. Welcome to the And She Looked Up podcast. Each week, we sit down with inspiring Canadian women who create for a living. We talk about their creative journeys and their best business tips, as well as the creative and business mindset issues all creative entrepreneurs struggle with. I'm your host, Melissa Hartfield, and after leaving a 20-year career in corporate retail, I've been happily self-employed for 12 years. I'm a graphic designer, an illustrator, and a multi-six-figure-a-year entrepreneur in the digital content space. This podcast is for the artists, the makers, and the creatives who want to find a way to make a living doing what they love. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the And She Looked Up podcast. I'm your host, Melissa, and if I sound a bit stuffy or plugged up, it's because I mowed the lawn last night and didn't take my allergy medication, so I feel very drippy and clogged up today. But I am super excited because today I am welcoming back Lisa Bolton. Hello, Lisa.
Oh, hello. It's so nice to be back.
It's nice to have you here. I'm so excited. For those of you who've been listening to the podcast since its inception, you will know that Lisa and I co-founded the podcast and co-hosted the podcast back in its early days. I think you were here for the first 20 episodes or so.
Something like that. Yeah, that sounds right. It feels like a long time ago.
Yeah, it was 2 years ago. Yeah. And you've been back since. We had you back. We did a fun episode about a year ago on visualizing success. So I'll put a link to that in the show notes so everybody can check that out. But you are here today because we are going to be talking about knowing when it's time to move on from your creative business, to move on or to have a significant pivot, I guess, a big change either way. And this is a fluke that the timing worked out like this, but I thought as I was thinking about it this morning, it's actually a really great follow-up from the episode we did last week, which was on creative burnout, because one of the questions that I said you should ask yourself when you're trying to decide if you're burnt out is whether or not your business is still something that sparks joy in you, that you enjoy, that still meshes with your personal values and what you want to get out of your career. And sometimes the answer to that question might not be the one that you think it will be. And that's when it can be time to start thinking about whether or not you should make a change in your business. But I think the thing that surrounds that, and we're going to be talking about it a lot today, is fear. There's a lot of fear around the idea of moving on or making significant change. So when I was thinking about it this morning, I'm like, this is going to be an episode about a lot of fear. But I think we're going to try and approach it in a way where it's fear that leads to something very positive. So we're going to get into the weeds of that. We're going to be talking a little bit about some of the signs that it might be time for you to move on, and some of the fears around moving on, and some of the fears about starting over. And we're also going to talk a little bit about what your options are when you do decide that it's time to move on. Like, what do you do with this business that you no longer want, that no longer fits? And the reason this episode came about is because both of us in the last year or two have gone through some pretty significant changes with what we do for creative work. And so, let's talk a little bit about that. So before we get too far into that, like what have you been up to the last year? Because I know you are making some changes in what you're doing. So yeah, what can you tell us?
Yeah, well, thank you. Well, yeah, it's so interesting because I really do feel like I went from, my original career, sort of how I defined myself through my 20s and most of my 30s was like I was employed by. I had a career in banking, really worked, and it was very much my identity was tied up in, my employment contract. And I was really proud of that. I worked hard for it, and it did spark a lot of joy in me. And so, but it was very traditional. There was no I got up and went to work every day because that was what I was supposed to do. And I didn't think about moving on at that point. And then, of course, when I did end up pivoting into entrepreneurialism and creative work, then it became a very different mindset because then you were constantly thinking about the next step and everything, a lot more uncertainty, and just a whole different mindset when you're in that space. But then came the point where, much like with the theme of our conversation today about when it was time, I knew it was time. And there wasn't one particular moment. I could feel it. And then, I just knew. So for me, I really did step back from all of my creative work. I think a lot of it came from I became very disenfranchised with social media. Mm-hmm. And we're going back, and I think everything, with our with everything that's happened in the last 2 years, it's always going to be a permanent marker in time for everybody. I think we will always. I was just talking to a girlfriend the other day about. I remember when the pandemic clicked for me. Like I remember sitting and we were watching. I think it was like the NBA had just been canceled or something, where we were like, "Oh wow! Like this moment in time, I will remember." Mm-hmm. So I think that's always going to be a pivot point for a lot of people in just how the world shifted. But for me, that combined with I just found the social media aspect becoming such a huge part of a creative entrepreneur's world in how you had to interact and navigating all of that was just clashing with how I felt about it. And that was the start of the decline in joy for me personally. It just wasn't feeling authentic. And then I think things kind of changed from there. So yeah, I did start to take a step back, and have spent, I would say, the last year, certainly since the fall. I did choose to homeschool my son for a year and a half during the pandemic. So that that was just a forced pivot at that point, that my creative brain doing grade 5 math had no space for anything else. So that definitely weighed on me. But since certainly September, I've really felt this urge to get back into something. And it has been evaluating opportunities, not based necessarily on the opportunity themselves, but priority one being for me, my lifestyle and keeping the balance in place. I felt like that tipped the wrong way, whether I really want to dip my toe into the world of something digital or I don't know what the opposite of digital is in real life, product-based, service-based. Is that sort of the opposite?
Bricks and mortar, I guess, if you're selling.
Yeah, bricks and mortar, I guess. Yeah. And really going through that, because I think I've been able to separate what does spark my joy is not necessarily the widget or the thing at the end. It's all the pieces that come into making that widget or that thing. Like that is where my passion lies.
Yeah. I think I'm very similar. I think that's what makes me a true entrepreneur. Is, to me, the fun is building the business. Mm-hmm. That's the fun part, right? And I really enjoy that whole process of like making all the pieces work together.
So for me, that's what I've spent the last, I knew I was going to take the fall off. I knew between September and December, I just wanted to say I'm not going. And, one of the hardest part, I would say, under this theme is when you have been an entrepreneur, people asking you all the time, so what are you working on? What's next? What are you doing next? Like for me, having been an author, are you working on the second book? When's the next book coming out? So I really struggled for a while with not having an answer for that. I felt like I needed to say, oh yeah, no, I absolutely, like I'm on it, or I'm doing, and it felt like, oh, Pete, that's expected. I've recently come to terms with, it's okay to say that's not right for me, or I've stepped away from that. Like I don't know why I really struggled with saying that for a long time, but
yeah, I mean,
people are asking you what's next all the time.
It's the whole hustle mindset, right?
Yeah.
You always have to be doing something. You always have to be working on something. It's weird to take time away. You know?
Yeah. Well, and you've gone through that with the change with FBC. I'm sure people are asking you all the time, like, so what's next? Right?
Yeah, I mean, and for those of you who don't know, like Lisa you had written a book. It was a best-selling book. You were speaking at a lot of events. People wanted you to come create boards for them. You did a lot of edible board design, that type of thing. So you were you were the go-to person in Canada for that. So, you know, you had a very successful business that I think a lot of people would have seen it as like a dream business almost, you know?
Yeah, and definitely. And I think that's the part that it was maybe made it even more difficult as I stepped away a bit to even while it was peaking. So I was getting these opportunities and they were flooding. They were, and in the best way. And I was super grateful. And, but it almost became overwhelming because the work itself wasn't inspiring. I wasn't feeling like people seemed enamored with something I could do that I was not enamored with. And I was thinking, well, why would they even want me to talk about, like, it was such a disconnect. And I wish I could have pushed through that.
Yeah.
Especially from a financial perspective. I feel like, who am I to turn this work down?
Exactly. Very hard to turn money down.
Very hard to turn. And just, I felt like, who am I to what? Like, we could use the money. Like, that's like, there's no, you know, and so it was very, it was a struggle a lot. But the work, when you're in this creative, I think it has to be there. You have to, or I think people can see through it. I think people can see, and it doesn't become, I feel like the quality would change. I don't know. It was, but I definitely, because when I look back, especially with the, like I did a lot of TV appearances and I was very fortunate to have some producers reach out and say, hey, like when you're like, anytime you come. And I was like, wow, these are the national, you know, TV.
You were on like The Social and Marilyn Dennis, I think.
Yeah, exactly. So, and multiple times, and they were happy with my work, which was awesome. But I don't know. It was like, once I had ticked the goal, I'd reached, like, that was a goal for me. And once I reached it, it was interesting where I was like, oh, wow, doing it again and again isn't firing me up. No. Like, I'm not. Yeah. And so I think there's a lot in the creative world of like, oh, they've, you know, crashed and burned and they left. Whereas I decided to quit. And I think those are two very different. And I think sometimes there's this feeling that maybe you have to work harder. Like, that's not the answer to every creative crisis. Work harder, do more.
It's
right?
not. And it's funny, just listening to you talk, this ties up so much with everything that we talked about in last week's episode on burnout. And one of the things that you mentioned there that immediately triggered me to thinking back to that episode we did last week was phoning it in. Like, it was just something that you can do something. You're so good at it and you've been doing it for so long that it's almost second nature. And so you dial it, you just phone it in and you're not actually enjoying it, or you're not necessarily doing inspired work. Maybe that's
I don't
the best
feel
way.
like I'm being creative. I feel I'm just going back into the archives here and it's repetitive. It becomes a bit monotonous. It becomes like I'm on autopilot. Like,
autopilot is a great word. Yes.
Like, that's what I'm not really thinking, and therefore it's not inspiring because I could kind of do it with my eyes closed. Like, and I don't think it takes away from the quality of the output itself, but for me, the quality of the experience,
it just
starts to dwindle.
You're not feeling it. And that's another sign of burnout, that something's not right. You're just not getting any satisfaction from doing the work. And I've definitely experienced that in my career, where it's like you could do this in your sleep, but it's just not lighting you up inside. And so, definitely it's definitely something that it's a marker or a red flag that something's not right, and that maybe it's time to reevaluate what you're doing. And you're right. I sold my previous business. I've mentioned it a few times on the podcast. I had a business partner, and we wound up selling in November, but we had started going through the selling process almost 2 years before that. Yeah. And it's really funny because we kind of knew, we did this month-long road trip across Canada for work in 2018. And I knew at the end of that road trip that things weren't right. Something just wasn't sitting right. I wasn't happy.
It was a feeling, right?
It was a feeling, yes. But things were going well. The business was doing well, and we were connecting with our target people, and the community was there. And so I didn't say anything because I didn't want to rock the boat. And it all surrounds that whole fear of like change, and things are good right now, so why would you mess it up? You know?
Absolutely.
And then it was actually my partner who came to me and said, I don't think I want to do this anymore, and forced the issue. And this is the thing, our brains are wired to keep things status quo. Like our brains are wired to keep us safe.
Homeostasis, right? That's
exactly.
The body's trying to keep us always in homeostasis.
Yeah. So our brain is just going to try and keep everything at an even keel, keep everybody happy, satisfied, just safe, you know. And so that can keep us trapped in a place that maybe isn't that great for us. But I've always found that the universe has a very interesting way of stepping in and forcing change when it's needed. Whether, you know, if you don't make the change, the universe will make the change for you. And I think for some people, the pandemic was the universe coming along and saying, nope, time to change. But other people have maybe experienced it, you know, when you're let go from a job that you didn't see it coming. And you're kind of like, oh, what am I going to do now? And then if somebody asks you 2 or 3 years later, you're like, that was the best thing that ever could have happened to me. But you never would have made the move on your own because it was just, everything was fine.
Exactly. And it can be scary. And you know, the fear of the unknown can be paralyzing. And if someone presses pause and gives you a chance to hop off safely, that can be all you need to find this new freedom, right?
Yeah.
I think I was able to, because I really wrestled with, because I just come from a very industrious family. You just work hard. You don't stop. You never stop working. Just work. Yeah. And you don't quit. That's for sure.
Yes.
Why would you, you know, the looking a gift horse in the mouth? Like, what are you thinking? Like, you've got this thing, you've got this opportunity, like you hustle. And I think that when I was able to rephrase that, quitting didn't mean I was giving up. Quitting meant I was taking control. And I think that changed my entire mindset about stepping away from, whether it was another book or a series or workshops or the next thing. I wasn't quitting my thing. I was taking control so that I was going to drive what came next when the timing was right.
That is such a good way to reframe it. I think a lot of people could probably write that down.
Well, it was really, that's right. Like it's knowing that I have the power, and it wasn't, I think I felt like, you know, the emails would come into request and I'd be like, oh, well, someone wants, and that's not the feeling you should have. I didn't want to feel, as an entrepreneur, I'm the owner of this business. Why did I feel powerless?
Yeah.
So I think it was, oh no, I have the power to stay or go. I'm going to exercise that power. I'm going to decide. And I think it just made me stand up taller and feel more confident in what I was doing. And this wasn't about trying to work less or be less. This was actually the opposite of that.
Yeah, no, I really like the way that you were able to reframe that for yourself, because it's not quitting. It's just saying, you know, it's totally okay to say, I don't like doing this.
Yeah.
I don't want to do it anymore. That's okay.
Yeah.
And absolutely. When you're an adult, you are allowed to make those choices. And it's not like you said, I don't like doing this. I want to lie on the couch and watch television all day.
Yeah.
You're just like, I don't like doing this. I want to do something else.
Did you find that for you? Well, I was just thinking about because that was a significant change. And when you know, sold the business, was there when your partner came and said that, was that a sigh of relief? Like that was the extra push, or that made it okay?
It was a little different for me because I wasn't ready to move on yet. It was very odd. The business that we had many different arms to it, and there were certain arms that I was 100% ready to get rid of. Like if you had said, I will take this away tomorrow, I'd be like, go.
Yeah.
But then there were other pieces of the business that I was still very emotionally attached to and didn't want to give up. And I think my thought process had been that we needed to pivot rather than to move away completely.
Sure.
So I was a little behind him in terms of being ready to fully move on. I was not. This is one of the things when you're on your own, when you're the one who's in charge, you can make the call in whatever way you want. But when there's two of you and you're equal partners in a business, it becomes very much more of a negotiation almost.
Sure. Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. So, and that's kind of what we had to go through. We had to sort of figure out what all our different options were and find the one that could make us both feel at peace with the decision. So that was a big thing. And it took us a while to kind of get on the same page. And then it took us even longer to sort of, it was very interesting. The selling process, despite the fact that we were both ready to sell, or at least we were saying we were ready to sell, we really dragged it out. Like there was obviously resistance there.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, sure.
And it took us, I would say, it was pretty much almost exactly 3 years from the day we decided to sell to the day we actually sold. So, and so that was also interesting. Running a business for 3 years that you're moving away from was also very different. So, and we can get into that when we talk about like what your options are when you decide to move on. Right. But
did it trigger anything for you in terms of your value or your identity or your status or anything for you? Like, I know for me that was a part of.
Oh, after the sale.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah,
really.
Yeah, really. I'm. It's interesting because for the listeners, Lisa and I had been talking actually for a couple months about doing an episode where she interviewed me about the sale process, and I actually said to her last week, I'm not emotionally ready to do that episode because there's just a lot of emotion there that I just have not processed yet, and a lot of it is around my self-worth, like before I had this business that I owned for a decade, and I felt important, like I felt respected, I felt like my opinion mattered on things, and once the business sold, I felt like I just disappeared, like I just disappeared into the wall, the cornfield in Field of Dreams where he just disappears.
Just disappears, never to be heard from. Yeah, it's because it's very isolating and very and you're on your own and it was very weird, and there was other things going on in the background. My relationship ended, and there's a pandemic going on, and it was just there's just a lot in my head that I just need time to work through. But I absolutely had those feelings of like, who am I without this business? I don't really know. I went through it similar, and I think what was super triggering for me is the reason I got into the business was because I felt that, which is very common, I think, when women decide to stay home and raise a child. So,
which is something you did. You didn't actually mention that at the beginning, but you left your banking job after you had your son.
Yeah, that was the catalyst for me. And so 15 years, self-identified banker, and then have a baby. Felt confident, definitely a hard decision, but didn't have regret about the decision. But there's the horrible phrase that runs through my head, and I know a lot of women use, was, now I'm just a mom. And I'm using air quotes, like, I'm just a mom now. Like when people ask me what I do, I'm going to say, well, I'm just a mom. And that was, it's, first of all, moms are never just anything.
No, it's not that you're just a mom. It's just that other identity is gone.
And it was really, and so for me at the time, I was like, nope, that doesn't work for me. I need to, again, work harder, do more, be more, hustle. And that gave me that, like, this is back in, like, 2013, 2014, where I was like starting my food blog and starting to do photography. And this is where the idea of the board book came out of. And so that was all of those years came out of a fear of, I've lost my identity and my value and who I am. And now, fast forward to the last year and a half where I have, stepped away from my business, and it's like, the PTSD of it's coming back again. Like, oh, I'm back. I'm just a mom. And it takes a lot of effort to really push those words and that negative self-talk down, to say no, taking a pause to really figure out what I'm going to do and what that's going to look like and where I can best contribute and what uses my talents best, is not doing nothing. Like, there's that lead up, all the behind the scenes work where you're not, at the end of the day, I have nothing to show you, but I know that I've stretched myself creatively. I know that I've really, I think that's only going to benefit down the road, but it's so attached to my value and status, or my, like, in my own bubble of the world, that I feel
and I don't have kids, so I don't even have the mom identity. Like my identity was really wrapped up in my work, and then when you take away your significant relationship and you're not a mom and you don't have the work, it's like it really is like, who the hell am I, and who even cares? Just that breaks my heart, but I totally understand that. Like, I mean logically deep down I know that, of course, but that is, logic and those deep down feelings don't surface.
And you can't underestimate the power of an emotional investment in those things. Like, it can be paralyzing in some ways and can really be stifling.
And I think there are a lot of women out there who are creative and who do a lot of creative things in their spare time, but they don't see that as their serious business. Like, it's just sort of something they do for fun, I guess. I don't know. It's hard to explain, but I think there's because it's like, oh, I like to paint, but that's kind of what I do to goof off. And I hate to use the term goof off but that's kind of what it's like. It's like, that's what I do for fun. That's playtime. It's not, I'm not hustling. I'm not working. I'm not doing all the things, right?
Yeah. So, well, and this is where it goes back to, that's where I found my trigger with the social media world of things being, out there. All the creative stuff I was consuming was so perfect and beautiful, and everyone was having so much success in it. And I was just having a hard time relating to,
of course,
the beginning part of their journey. Yeah. Right. Like, I just think, who am I to think I can just hop right? Like, again, rational self, irrational. I understand that that's not all that was going on, but when you're kind of consuming that and maybe you're not fully you're thinking clearly that way, it almost creates this vicious circle of a downward spiral of like, well, then why, like, my stuff's not that, I can't compete in that world, I'll never. And so it's really, there's so many arms to it.
There is, and especially if your self-esteem has taken a bit of a beating, to kind of, social media is just not a healthy place when you're struggling with self-esteem issues.
No, definitely not. It's not the kind of place you go to boost yourself up, let me tell you.
No. So, all the things that we've been talking about right now, like, those are all signs that it might be time for you to consider moving on from what it is you're doing. Things aren't sparking joy. You are phoning it in. You are feeling that anxiety, like you mentioned, when you would look at your email and be like, ugh.
Yeah, please don't have there be a request to do work. Exactly. Like, what is wrong? Like, who am I? That is so, that's cringy right there when I hear that. But that's like, because there's no one litmus test, right? There's no one thing that says, oh, now it's time to move on.
No, I think if I could describe it, it's just a series of icky feelings, which is really not helpful. But there's just something, you just know that things are off. Things that normally would not feel icky just feel icky. Like, there's a vibe, or that's how I felt anyway. It just felt like there was just like something pressing, something felt kind of dark. It just didn't feel right. And I sort of felt like I wasn't being me.
Yeah.
So, those are all signs that something that you really need to have a serious talk with yourself, I think. And I think a lot of us avoid that serious talk because we don't want to deal with some potentially scary things or painful things or making a change or splitting. In my case, I had a business partner. It almost felt like a divorce. Right?
Oh, I think it can be harder than one sometimes. Yeah, no, for sure.
And we're on good terms, so it's not like it's not like we were having screaming knockdown drag out fights or anything like that. It was just like we were both just ready to move on. And I think part of it for me was also just not feeling the challenge there anymore. I like to feel challenged, not to the point where I'm drowning or anything, but to the point where I feel like, if I just made this little tweak, what could happen? Or if I just made, I like to feel that. And this is a conversation Ethan and I had actually a couple of years prior to the decision that we didn't want to do this anymore, where we had done a conference, and I think it was our 5th conference. I think it was our last one. Or we were prepping for our last one. And we had both kind of just sat down and said, we did our first conference 5 years ago. And the reason we did the second conference is because we did the first one and we were like, we can do better. Like, we can do better. It was a personal challenge to ourselves.
Kind of exciting too, right?
Yes. And we were just like, that's what it was. We had to grab the challenge, and it was almost like a dare. Like, we can do it. And so we did the second one, and we still felt that way at the end of the second one. We can still do better. And by the time we had done the 4th one, we kind of just looked at each other. We had the 5th one in the pipeline. We were working on it. And we were like, it just doesn't feel the same. Like, I don't think we can do better in the context of how we were working.
Yeah.
And that's what triggered us doing this month-long road trip. Like, that felt like the next challenge for us.
Yeah.
But yeah, we had just both reached this point where we kind of looked around and we were like, this business still has a lot of potential, but we're not the people to take it forward. We're not interested in getting, a lot of the things that would have taken it forward would have been some significant technology changes, and we just weren't interested in it. So, so we had definitely had conversations, and we definitely knew that things were not feeling quite right. But yeah, I think both of us were just kind of scared to be the one to say, yeah, no, I don't want to do this anymore. Because I think when you have a partner, there is also that fear of disappointing them or leaving them in the lurch. And I think you probably felt like when you decided to leave the podcast, I personally was fine with it.
I know, you couldn't have been more gracious and understanding.
But I think you probably were like, I think you probably stressed out over that longer than you let on because you didn't want to let me down.
For so many reasons. Yeah. First of all, I think because I believed in it so much. So again, this is this like walking away from something that is interesting and successful, a medium I love. Like, again, on paper, this makes perfect sense to me, like such a great fit. And then the reality was I was struggling, just struggling with everything and trying to balance and feeling inspired, and it just wasn't clicking. And it was, so there's that. Then there's the, just so your own self, and then there's the letting someone down, letting your partner down and saying like, oh my gosh, like this is totally, this is not how I envisioned this. And I value this person and I don't want to leave them and let them down. So 100%, like, when at the end of the day, but I had to do the work. Like, I do think, it is important because sometimes it can just be a phase, or sometimes it can be,
for sure,
like, it's not all fun and roses and it's hard. And so definitely, you have to make sure you've done that piece. But yeah, the wrestling with it can just eat you up. But then the relief, like even just when I wrote you without even sending it, I was like, oh yeah, this is the right decision for me. Like,
it's like I can breathe.
I can breathe. Yeah. And so sometimes I think going through that exercise, and, I've done a lot of journaling. I've like made lists. I've like got lots. I'm, me and my spreadsheets, but I'm an Excel girl, but I like have made things with even different projects over the last year where just getting it out of me can indicate, no, I'm not quite ready for that. Oh no, I still see that. Or we close the book, sunset on that goal and move on. Right.
Yeah.
But I think there's that whole feeling of no, thou shall not quit. And that was the big aha moment for me, was that quitting is not giving up. Like, right, it's just move, like I said, just taking control. That's really been my theme for things.
Yeah. It's funny. You sort of taking me back to my childhood. My parents had this rule with us that if we started something, we had to see it out for a full season. So it was usually sports, but sometimes it was other things. So like, okay, you know what? You want to play soccer? You can play soccer, but if you sign up, you have to play the full year. You can't drop out halfway through, like no quitting. At the end of the year, if we didn't like it, we didn't have to re-enroll the next year. Like that was fine. But the point was, my parents didn't want us quitting just because something was hard.
Right.
Like they wanted us to quit because we really didn't like it. Yeah. And sometimes you have to get through those initial early stages where it's hard to realize that, yeah, it was hard, but I really like it. I actually do really like it. Or, yeah, it was hard, but you know what? I hate it, right? Yeah. So sometimes you need to get through those early hard stages to really know how you feel about it and do that work. So I don't think that's wasted, but for sure, there's definitely a lot of emotion around feeling that you're letting people down.
Letting people down, absolutely. And then you have to push through those days of where there's nothing to show for. Like I found like weeks where you're working and like you've got nothing, no item, no widget at the end of the day. Like I find that's really, but sometimes that's what's necessary. And I learned that through the book process, a lot of the behind the scenes stuff, and that at the end of the day there's a book on the shelf, but there's a lot that goes in that. It's not fun and not sexy and not really inspiring, and can be tedious. And when you're an entrepreneur, you have to wear all those hats. That was a big adjustment coming from employment, where if I had HR issues, I called the HR people. Or if
your computer didn't work, you called IT.
The maintenance people. Like I did not. Everything comes, and that more than anyone. Like you are all those departments, and so you have to be able to be up for the challenge of what comes with that and being a creative entrepreneur. But I think having the courage and the ability to dip your toe in a lot of different waters is part of the process, and it's coming back and going in again and coming back. And I think your conference is very similar to me with writing another book. So I
mean, if you had written Boards 2.0, it wouldn't really have been a challenge for you. It would have just been writing the same book but changing it a little.
And I see a lot of cookbook authors come out with a second book, and I see a lot of it's like, especially when the first one's successful, it's like, okay, the natural is to come out with a second one. I think it's like sequels to movies, right?
Yes.
And rarely is number 2 better than number 1. But I knew that for me, it wouldn't be. I knew that there's only so much I could do and get fired up about, and it would really feel like work. And that wasn't why I did that. As much as there was a lot of hard work in the first book, it was super fun, and every experience was like, wow, I learned so much.
It was exciting.
But much like your conference, right? I'm like, I don't think I can do it better. Like, I don't think on this topic in this medium, I don't think I can do that better than this. And
exactly. And with the amount of money we had to spend and all those things, like I think we've topped it out. Like I just don't see. And I think that's a really real fear around moving on, is it can be very easy to look at all the time and the money, frankly, that you've invested in something.
Yeah.
It's almost like a sunken cost, right? You've sunk all this time, like 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years of your life into this thing. And it's like, do I really want to walk away from that? Like, we don't get our time back, right? So that's a finite resource that you've sunk into this business that you've created. And I think if the business is successfyou that can make it even hard. Like we had a successful business.
Yeah, exactly. So with a lot of people depending on you, like, you have a huge community that, you were invested in and they were invested in you. And it's a lot of pressure.
Absolutely. And I think if something's giving you a regular paycheck and making your life comfortable, right? Yeah. If you have a successful business and it's paying all your bills plus some, and you're able to do a lot of things that money allows you to do, like travel or spend time with family or take time off throughout the year or whatever the case may be, the fear of giving that up is very real, especially if you have a family or if you're the breadwinner. That can be really frightening to be the one to say, I don't want to do this anymore.
No, and definitely from a place of privilege. Like I was, I definitely preface the spot that my paycheck was not depended on at home. And so for me, that, and even then it was still a really tough decision. So I can only imagine when you're feeling like, yeah, that's all great, but I've got bills to pay and I can't necessarily afford. So that can be a really tough pivot to, be able to do the work required maybe for the next thing or what really does inspire you while still having responsibilities and not the luxury of being able to step away too.
Yeah, and that's very true. And I've definitely had that conversation with friends who've said, oh, I wish I could do what you're doing, but I haven't, I have kids, I have a mortgage, I have all these things to take care of. And I mean, there are lots of people out there with kids and mortgages who are self-employed and who are entrepreneurs. So, absolutely. But again, not every personality is cut out to be an entrepreneur. So there's that too. So there's no right or wrong decision about whether you choose to stay in your 9-to-5 job or whether you choose to start a business or whether you choose to move on from a business. But there is a lot of fear that's wrapped up in it because when you give it up, there's this big unknown out there.
And I think one thing I've learned, because I'm a people pleaser by nature, and I have found that I trying to not overestimate my own importance in people's lives. And I think on this, and this comes to like canceling a dinner reservation. Like this is like just to the minutia too, but even as a business owner, they will be disappointed if I say I cannot do that project for them or that board for them, or they will be and I would struggle with that a lot. So for me, letting people down, not being able to say, yes, I can help you with that. Thinking, they're going to be so upset. And then, really it's like, you know what? No, they might be disappointed and then they'll move on. Like stop overestimating my own importance or significance because people move on. It's just like in my corporate world days, like you would think an employee was indispensable and they may leave the organization and life started up the next day. You had the goodbye party, but things didn't come to a grinding halt. And I really had to get out of my own head around this community or these people depending on me or needing me and saying, I just need to not overestimate my own importance sometimes and realize that people worry about themselves. Really it's about you. And so I needed to do that too and think like, yeah, I have to get over like, yep, I'm going to let that person down or that person might be disappointed, but that's not what's best for me. And it sounds so simple when I would write it out or think about it, but there was something inside that was a big hurdle for me. And it's not for a lot of people. Some people are super easy.
Some people are totally fine letting other people down.
My husband is someone who is very black and white and be like, no, that doesn't work for me. And like, he's good. And he moves on. But for me, I'm like, ooh, should I, couldn't I? And I'm still I feel like I'm a confident person. I have a good sense of self, but I struggle with that a lot. I'm like, I don't want to hurt someone's feelings or disappoint. And I think that can be a stumbling block when it's to walk away from something.
Absolutely. It's a combination of not wanting to disappoint people, but also wanting to feel like you are needed, right? Like, totally. We all want to feel like we're needed and what we're doing is important. And so
I want to be invited. I just don't want to go.
Exactly.
I want to be asked to do the work, but I don't really want to do the work.
I am such an introvert. Like I will quite happily stay home and not go out. But I've told my friends many times, it's like, because they're like, well, we don't invite you because you never come. And it's like, but I still want to be invited. I still want to feel like you would want me.
I know. It's so true.
so I totally get that. Yeah. Definitely. But I think also there is this whole fear of what's next. Like once you make the decision, okay, this isn't working. I need to move on. Like, okay, but what do I do next? Like that can be very scary too, because depending on your situation, you might need a paycheck the next month. Yep. Maybe if you're fortunate and you've been able to put money aside, so you have a bit of a runway fund to help you work through what it is you want to do next. But I think there is a lot of fear around starting over. Like the big question is, well, what do I actually do next? Who would be interested in anything I have to say? It's so full of contrasts, just even talking about it out loud right now. Like in one breath, we're saying, we want to feel important, and it's really hard leaving because we've built up a reputation and people respect us and we're part of a community and we're called upon as a subject matter expert. And then in the next breath, we're like, well, if I leave, who would even want me?
Yeah.
You know? It's like, I can't do anything.
I'm definitely learning that two contradictory thoughts can exist at the same time.
It's like, I'm not good at anything. Nobody's going to want to hire me. Nobody's going to want to talk to me. So when you step back and look at it that way, it's bizarre how our brain talks to us.
Oh my gosh, it's so true. And that's the process I think that I've spent, like I said, I kind of took September to December to really just focus in on not having to worry about my next thing, because that was such a and I really was like, no, I'm just like not going to give it thought. I'm going to focus on other projects that I have to do and other things in my life. But since January, I've definitely been feeling that itch. I'm like, yeah, I'm going to need something. And I think the process I've been trying to make time and space for on a regular, like sort of daily, weekly basis, is really reverse engineering. So really going to like, okay, what is the end goal look like if I was to fast forward a year or 2 years from now, and what things were happening in my life that I would say, oh, that was a good choice, and then starting to really work that backwards and pull out less again about the detail and the thing itself, but like what sort of boundaries do I need to set up, what things are sacred in my current life that I feel like, okay, I've got some balance, I'm feeling I've got a good a good balance of like hard work, research, challenging things, but I've got the time and space where I'm not needed as a wife or as a mom or as a friend, and I've just got time to recharge. And what would that look like? And trying to figure out what kind of business opportunity I can create that is going to fit in those slots. And it's a lot of work to figure that out. Like I don't want to keep doing the going in, jumping in full and then having to step back. I really want to be prescriptive and deliberate and intentional about setting up whatever this next chapter looks like, for sure.
Yeah, and you actually sat me down to talk about reverse engineering, because I think that when we knew we were going to sell our previous business, obviously we didn't announce it the moment we decided we needed to do stuff in the background. But I did talk to you about it, and I was really genuinely worried because I had kind of put my graphic design career way back on hold to do this other, and I was kind of like, I don't know how I'm going to earn a living, and I needed to earn a living. I didn't have the luxury of being able to take the time off, and I was really quite panicked about it. And you're like, well, how much do you need every month? And I told you my number, and you're like, okay, well, let's sit down and work it backwards. Like, how much could you make doing this, and how much could you make doing that? And we kind of like, it was very reassuring once I started stepping backwards and chunking it out, and realizing like, this is just steps. Like, this is my goal at the end, but these are the steps that I need to take to get to that money goal every month. And what can I do that will make that happen? And it calmed me down. Tremendous.
Well, I'm so glad, because it's one of the things I'd actually had on my notes to mention today too, was how I think it's just like mission critical that especially entrepreneurs, with or without a partner, but entrepreneurs talk to other people, because you have no perspective inside. You have to talk to others. And I'm a super private person. I don't like talking to people about things that are going on or struggles I'm having. I'm not good at that. But I have found some people in my life that I can talk to, and they've brought so much perspective in. Like, those light bulbs are like, oh, okay, because you don't have it in yourself, right? You're too, all the emotions and the self-doubt or the previous experiences you've had, like, they cloud it all. And I think that's why, like, people see therapists too. Like, they can come in and say, I don't know all the other backstories, but I see the facts clearly. And here's how we can, so I would so encourage people. And I used to say this when I did small business banking and talking to entrepreneurs, is like creating that little circle of advisors in your life, or your little, board of director people that you can go to on occasion that may not be connected to you super personally. And I'm not even talking a mentor. I'm talking someone you can just be like, here's the situation. Like, how would you approach this? What do you think? And it's brought me so much clarity, or just even spark something that I can jump off of. And I think sometimes as entrepreneurs, and God, you add a pandemic in, like we're all just holed up, isolated, alone in a lot of cases. And it's so important when you're thinking about moving on or on to the next thing to not be afraid to talk to someone that you trust, that can just be an external voice. They don't even have to have areas of expertise. They don't have to be an entrepreneur, but they can, I think, can help you walk through some of that.
Definitely. It's just having that person, like you said, who isn't caught up in all your internal BS.
Yeah. Like my husband isn't helpful for me for that. Like, it's great having a partner at home, and he's super supportive, but he doesn't have the perspective. Like, he's not.
I had the same issue. Yeah.
Right.
In my relationship, like, super supportive, but just not the person to talk about the nitty gritty with.
No. And not someone who also like maybe keep you honest or challenge you a bit more with questions where I won't get my back up. My husband challenges me all the time, but I bite back. But with someone else, it might be a better conversation. So yeah, I just think really getting perspective from someone else, if you're thinking about moving on, can be so helpful.
Yeah. Another big one for me personally was this fear that the business I was giving up was a fluke. Like somehow we made it successful. And I don't really know. It
was your last good idea?
Yeah. I don't know really how we did it. And I don't know if I could do it again. And I'm still kind of dealing with that internally. But I think that's a real legitimate fear that a lot of people have. And I think other people have the opposite. They're afraid of being successful. And that is something which sounds so silly when you say it out loud, but it's a real thing.
It is.
There are people out there who really are like, I don't know how they would deal with it if it was successful. So there's, as you can tell from everything we've said over the last hour, there is just a lot wrapped up in making this choice. But I do really believe, and maybe this is a bit woo-woo, but I really do believe, like, if you don't make the choice, something external will make the choice for you.
Yes.
Whether you like it or not. So whether that's being laid off from a job, whether it's a health crisis, whether it's having to move across the country, or something significant in your life changes. And I remember hearing a grief counselor once talk about how when somebody really close to you passes away, or you go through some kind of major life change like a divorce or something like that, that you shouldn't make any critical decisions for a year, because your brain isn't processing, like your brain is processing everything, and it's not ready to maybe make clear decisions. And I don't think you need to wait a year for everything, and everybody's different, but there is just definitely something about taking a moment to just let yourself work through it, at least partially, before you move on to trying something new. And I know we don't always all have that option. Like I just said earlier, for me, I had to earn, and it had to happen right away. And so I didn't have the time to process it as much as we were going through the sale. But for me, it came more after the sale. But when we finally sold, I had actually been running. I had been back up and running on my own for almost a year, about 11 months at that point. It was November. So I did have income coming in. So now I was kind of in a position where I had regular clients and things were going in the right direction. And I had a little bit of time to actually process what was happening. And I'm still struggling with it all.
For sure. And it's funny because even jumping off on that, I would say it's also important if you're not at a point right now where you're saying, oh, this is not, not something I'm looking to move on for, but having that conversation with yourself every year or every 6 months or what that looks like. But as an entrepreneur, saying, making space to say, I'm going to spend the afternoon thinking about, am I where I need to be? Do I see myself being in the same spot next year? Like, really not maybe waiting for the icky feeling, not waiting for the piece, but really saying, like, where do I see myself doing this next year? And maybe taking some time to visualize. Good plug for the episode on visualization. Or taking time to, really think about those things maybe before the feelings of uncertainty or the niggly starts, and being proactive in those thoughts.
One of the things I did in my business this year for the first time ever, and I felt so grown up and proud of myself when I did it in January, is I scheduled myself a CEO day every month for the whole year. They're in my calendar, they're in my planner, and that's exactly what I do on those days. Is I sit down, I go through all my numbers for the previous month, I look at all the things I'm doing, I look at what I'm happy with, what I'm not happy with, and it has made such a huge difference for me just in terms of clarity. I don't know that it's necessarily made my business better, but for me personally, I feel much clearer on what it is I want to do. I'm evaluating, because I'm very much the type of person, like, shiny idea, I just jump in and I do it.
Yeah.
And so sometimes I need to step back after I've done it and be like, is this actually working, Melissa, or should you keep doing this? Or yes, it is working. And like, how can I continue on with it and build on it? So being able to do that has made a really big difference for me. And I think now that just what you said is that, without even realizing it when I did it, but you're absolutely right. It's helping me catch things and make small pivots before I ever get to the point where I need to make a really huge pivot because it's not working. Yeah, so I think that's been super helpful. I highly recommend it. You hear all these coaches and stuff telling you to do that, and this was the first year I actually tried it, and I'm quite pleased with how it's
great.
Worked
Yeah,
out. Yeah. So if you are at the point where you've decided it's time to move on, what do you actually do? Because I think this is another thing. It's like, well, I have this business. Like, what do I do with it? And this is where there's a few different options that you can do. And in my case, I decided to sell. I had a business partner. So for us, the options were basically one of us could buy the other one out. But I think once we actually, and I actually did consider that in the beginning. I considered buying him out or bringing on a partner to take over who could buy him out. But in the end, we decided to actually sell and split the proceeds from the sale. I think in your case, you didn't sell, but you didn't exactly shelve it either. I think
I like to call it a sunset.
Yes, that's a nice way to put it. You sort of let it disappear gradually.
Yeah, a little. I did. And you know what? Rightly or wrong, if I look back, would I have done something more intentional? I'm not sure even that I would have. I think, I think the idea of just letting it slowly come to its natural. And I think maybe because I wanted to keep the door open. So I do think that this could just be a pause, and maybe there will be something that will spark a joy or a pivot or and maybe a different direction. I don't think I was ready to say, wrap that up with a bow and send it on its way. So I do think there can be value in, stepping maybe back into quietly back into the cornfield, as we were saying, and letting things just sort of see what comes out. I mean, with still letting people know. People reach out to me all the time for work, not all the time, but less and less. But I've been able to say, I've just stepped away for the time being because I do want to keep the door open. I think you don't know what life brings down the road, and maybe circumstances will change, and I'll need to jump back in. And I don't want to.
It's a good way to keep your network active,
absolutely,
right? Which is always helpful. Your network is always helpful, no matter what you decide to do.
Yeah. So. I think that what I would encourage to is not to underestimate the value of your business. I think we have a tendency to do that, and I know I've sort of done that in various aspects of my business. And I think even if it's a small, if you've got a lot of different pieces that you work off the side of your desk, like even some of the smalls, they have value. And I think don't underestimate that, because I look at all the aspects of the work even that you do. Each one of them, like there's the combined value of everything, but each one of them has a very specific and significant value to it that is that if you are thinking about selling, don't ever think just because it's too small or it's like, I think people should really, there's people will pay for what you've done, all the hard work. You've put all that in there, and there's people that are willing to say, oh, good, you've done that part. I'm willing to
yeah, absolutely.
step in and keep it going.
One of the things we knew with our business that we sold, one of the assets that we knew was very valuable, and this had nothing to do with the actual money the business generated, was our social media. We had a very robust social media following on all the platforms. And we knew that somebody starting from scratch today, trying to build a presence on social media from scratch today, is just like picking up gravel, pea gravel, and trying to build a building out of it.
Sure,
It is painful. And so we knew that for somebody to come along, that even just having that network of people that they could reach out to and our email list, we knew those were very valuable, even if the person didn't actually want to carry on with the actual business of what we did. So there's pieces for sure. And it's going to depend on how you structure your business as well. That business was incorporated. We did what was called an asset sale, where we sold pieces of the business, but not the actual business. So that's what my partner and I have been in the midst of doing the last few months, is dissolving the corporation. But if you're a sole proprietor, which is what I am now, I'm a sole proprietor with what I consider to be like 3 very separate arms in my business. And I did that very intentionally because I knew that if at any point, let's say I didn't want to do the podcast anymore, like that was an arm that I could potentially slice off and give to somebody else without dramatically disrupting my overall business. So and that's you mentioned pivoting in what you were saying. That's also a very real option. You don't necessarily have to shut your business down. You could simply pivot it and keep the social media and the SEO juice and all the like behind the scenes stuff that helps you with marketing. You can keep all that, but pivot the business, and you are absolutely going to lose people, but that's okay. You're going to gain people too. So,
but I would say the most people too that I love and follow who are creative entrepreneurs, at the end of the day, I've fallen in love with them, and I might like their work. And if they pivot in the work, I'm a fan. Like I think I'll probably, there's a high likelihood I'll stick with them through their next adventure and their next
curious,
journey.
At this
and
point,
you've got that personal connection, right?
You're emotionally invested in the person.
Exactly. And the artist and whatever they are creating. And so
definitely.
I think, not underestimating that your audience is still going to be there when you come up with your next thing. And so maybe being more honest and vulnerable and sharing that could work to your advantage when if you do pivot.
And you can absolutely shelve it as well. If you're just at the point where I am done, I don't ever want to go back. I don't want to go through the process of selling, because selling can be a very long process. And sometimes this was one of the things I struggled with selling, because like I said, it was a 3-year process. And by the end of the first 6 months of that 3 years, I was done. Like at that point, my brain had said, we're done. Time to move. Like I was already thinking to the next thing. And to have this thing hanging over me was like a 1,000-pound weight.
Oh,
absolutely. Not to say that it wasn't emotional and everything, and I didn't, all that stuff was all tied up in it. But if you are somebody who makes a decision quickly and is ready to act on it, maybe selling isn't the right thing for you to do. Maybe shelving is the better thing for your personality. So I think that's a very real option. And another one that doesn't get mentioned very often, but I have a friend who's doing this right now, is simply keeping the business, but delegating all the work. Hiring the people to run it. You're just the owner. And you hire somebody who, and this is going to depend very much on the type of business you have. Like if you're a painter, that's probably not going to work. Unless you decide to focus on selling prints or something and you have somebody who manages that for you while you move on to something else. But there's very real situations where you can simply hire people. Actually, she's in the process right now of bringing in people to run her business for her, and she's retiring from it. She'll stay on as the owner, and but she will not be involved in the day-to-day.
I very much considered that for the sort of board building, catering aspect of my business, because I thought this is very formula based, and I could definitely look at whether it be a franchise type of situation or something where I could teach people how to do it, and then they could go off into different markets and continue this. I would oversee it. And I definitely workshopped that and what that might look like, because yeah, I thought maybe this kind of keeps me in it. And, ultimately it wasn't the right fit, but there's a lot of businesses that you can, once you've created the piece, yeah, being able to simply have people replicate that and continue your work out there. Yeah.
I think if you do creative services, if you're like a wedding photographer or a graphic designer or a fashion designer, if you're a wedding photographer and you know that you're kind of coming to the end of your enthusiasm for what you're doing, hire on some other photographers to work with you and have them gradually take over. And this doesn't just, this is also pertinent to like retiring.
Yes.
At some point. And I would love to do an episode one day on exit planning strategies for creative business owners, because I think we tend to not think about that, but there is the possibility.
There will be a day,
where you're going to want to retire. And, I know mothers who've brought their daughters into their businesses, their creative businesses, and the daughters have gradually taken over. It could be somebody that you hire. But even big fashion houses, like Chanel is still a huge fashion house. Is Coco Chanel around? No.
Yeah, exactly.
And they're all like that. There is somebody else at the helm actually designing the clothes, and the name is now just a brand. It's not associated with a specific person anymore.
No, right.
So yeah, there's many different options for you when you decide that it is time to move on, and some of them might earn you some money, some of them might not. But it's important to kind of think about those things when you're making those decisions. So
yeah, exactly. And what you say, like in one of your CEO days of the month, like walking through some of those options and keeping them fresh, so you know what you've got, the value of your business, and what role you see yourself playing in it down the road.
Yeah, I think there was a great book that came out, The E-Myth, I think. Was it Michael Gerber?
Totally.
Yeah, and he talks about building your business to sell. Not that you ever will sell, but knowing that if you ever did decide to sell, you'd be in a position to sell it because you've got the systems built, and it's in a position where it's not reliant on you being there personally.
Exactly.
So there's always that. And it's a good idea. I'm just going to make one more plug for accountants. It's a really good idea to have this kind of check-in conversation with your accountant once a year, probably when you do your taxes. Is just say, like, if I was wanting to step back from the business right now, like, what kind of shape would we be in? What would be involved? Because they're really good at that, and they help people close their businesses and start their businesses all the time. So yeah, lawyers too. Our lawyer was invaluable to us. I will say this on the selling process. Super helpful. Couldn't have done it without him. So
many things you don't think of or don't.
And you just don't know.
You don't know. Yeah, exactly.
There's so much government nonsense involved that you don't know. So, yes,
true.
That is one thing I will say. It's expensive to sell a business. It's not cheap. So that's
good
something
point.
to keep in mind if you do decide to sell. It's not a cheap undertaking, especially if you're incorporated, because if you're incorporated, there are very specific government
different
things
level
that you have to do. So
it's such an interesting time, because I think people, with coming out of this pandemic and so much of day-to-day life looks different, we're using technology differently. I think it has been a year of change and pivots for people. And so, kind of knowing when it's the right time and how do you recognize that, and sort of, I think it's become a topic. A lot of people are making changes right now.
Definitely. I think a lot of people have had the opportunity to work from home for a couple of years now. A lot of people are heading back to the office and maybe realizing that this is not for them. Others are probably really happy to be back at the office. So it's all going to depend on your point of view.
So true.
And your personality. But I think this is an important thing to talk about, because I know the last 2 years I have definitely spoken to so many people who have been on the fence. Not sure if it's time, not sure if they're just going through a bad patch, not sure if it's a little bit of burnout, but definitely feeling unsettled, I guess, is the best word to describe it. So
and knowing that burnout isn't the only option, like you don't have to run it, right? Like
you don't need to run yourself into
decide the yes, exactly.
Usually if you run yourself into the ground, it's too late at that point. Like you've made your body's made the decision for you. Which, as I said, the universe has a way of making your decision for you. So Well, thank you so much for being here, Lisa. It was really, really good to have a
so
chat
nice
with you.
to be chatting with you again. I really enjoyed it.
I do. I love it when you get to come back on the show. So,
anytime.
Yeah, we'll have to think of some ways to bring you back next season.
I'd love that.
This is just a reminder, everybody, that we will be wrapping up season 3 at the end of June, taking our summer break from July and August, and we'll be back in September after the Labor Day weekend. But we have a few more episodes to go before then. But in the meantime, I will put the links to the previous episode that Lisa was on where we talked about visualizing success in the show notes. And if you want to listen to the other episodes that Lisa and I have done together, it is episodes 1 through 20, I think, way back. Those first few episodes don't have the best sound, but they were good.
They were good. Content was good. That's right.
Yes.
Our sound is improved.
I think it was episode number 4 that we did, the one on perfectionism and procrastination. Still one of the top 5 episodes of all time. That one gets constant replays all the time. So if you haven't listened to that one, go back and give that
some good nuggets.
Listen. Yeah.
For sure.
So I hesitate to almost ask this, but where can people reach you if they want to, or do you not want them to?
You know what? I still do have a presence on Facebook and Instagram at Lisa Bolton is where you can and I'm absolutely open to hearing from people. I do, as much as I talked about that feeling at first, I've certainly worked through a lot of that, and I'm excited to connect with people and love to hear what people are up to or what they would love to chat with me about. So yeah, that's probably the best way. Through my website is lisadonbolton.com, and my email is lisa@lisadonbolton.com. So you can find me there.
We'll put links to all of that in the show notes.
Fantastic.
All right. Well, thank you again. And thank you all for listening this week. And I will be back next week with another brand new episode. And we will talk to you all then. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us for the And She Looked Up Creative Hour. If you're looking for links or resources mentioned in this episode, you can find detailed show notes on our website at andshелookedup.com. While you're there, be sure to sign up for our newsletter for more business tips, profiles of inspiring Canadian creative women, and so much more. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to subscribe to the show via your podcast app of choice so you never miss an episode. We always love to hear from you, so we'd love it if you'd leave us a review through iTunes or Apple Podcasts. Drop us a note via our website at andshелookedup.com or come say hi on Instagram at andshелookedup. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.